My ex-husband laughed when he saw me starting from scratch, but cried when he saw me a millionaire. I was married for 17 years to a man who said he loved me, until the day he looked me in the eyes and said I couldn't handle living without him. He left me with one suitcase, a pile of debt, and an open wound in my chest. Starting from scratch seemed impossible, but even surrounded by pain, something inside me refused to give up. Every tear turned into strength. Every humiliation became motivation. And what began with small, silent steps transformed into something much bigger than I could have ever imagined. Today, my story inspires thousands of women to start over, even when all seems lost. I am immensely happy to have you here. Follow my journey to the end and comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. For a long time, I believed my marriage was built on strong roots, planted in true love and mutual respect. Martin was the man with whom I built a home, a family, and all my future plans. In the photos that still decorate some forgotten drawers, there are sincere smiles, at least on my part. I remember the impromptu dinners that turned into parties just because we were together. The birthdays filled with small but meaningful gestures. All of it seemed solid, until it wasn't anymore. The cracks were subtle at first. Prolonged silences, touches that no longer carried tenderness, and glances that passed right through me as if I were made of glass. I thought it was just time, stress, the routine. I justified the unjustifiable. Because when you love someone, it's easier to turn a blind eye than to face the naked truth. I kept trying. More affection, more patience, more of myself. And he grew more distant with each passing day. There were nights I waited for him with dinner on the table, only to receive a curt message saying he had to work late. I started collecting his excuses like one collects scars. Even my laughter began to fade. There was no more partnership, only cohabitation. And I kept pretending everything was fine, like an actress who refuses to leave the stage even after the audience has gone home. It didn't happen overnight, but at some point I began to realize that I was alone. Even with company, even while married, even with the smiling photos on the walls. The worst kind of loneliness is the one that lives within four walls built by two people. And by the time I finally faced that emptiness, it had already become an abyss. The truth is, his love for me had already died. I just didn't know it yet. Martin didn't try to hide it. On that rainy morning, he walked into the kitchen and said he wanted to talk, but his expression was as serene as it was icy. I sat at the table with a heavy heart, expecting anything but the words he delivered with rehearsed cruelty. I want a divorce, Ellie. This doesn't make sense anymore. And before I could react, he added, and you won't make it on your own, you know that. Each word was a dull blow to my chest. The coldness with which he looked at me, as if I were just another task to be checked off his list, left me stunned. You've always been too dependent, Ellie. Always in your own little creative world, but with no idea how the real world works. I remained silent, not for lack of a response, but because my body felt paralyzed, as if the right to react had been torn from me. He stood up and began walking through the house as if it were no longer mine. He pointed out the division of assets with a startling casualness, like someone commenting on the weather forecast. The house stays with me, of course. You can take the car. And, well, let's make things easy so we don't waste time with lawyers. As if this were a business negotiation and not the end of a life built together. Still dazed, I tried to question him, to understand, to ask for a little respect. But he just laughed condescendingly and muttered, "You'll try to survive, Ellie. But you weren't born for it." That comment, more than any other, tore me apart. Not just for its cruelty, but because it reflected exactly what he thought of me. What he had always thought. He smiled and said, "Good luck trying to get by without me, Ellie." I closed the door behind him and stood there motionless. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just listened to the sound of the kitchen clock, marking the seconds between who I was before that conversation, and who I would need to become from that moment on. My hands were shaking, but my body didn't give way. Something in me was beginning to understand that what was collapsing wasn't just a marriage, but my entire identity. In the weeks that followed, I was pushed into roles I never wanted to play. The abandoned wife. The discredited woman. The failure. But even in the face of so much brokenness, there was a spark in me that refused to be extinguished. I clung to my dignity like someone grabbing onto a plank in a stormy sea. Every meeting with lawyers, every document I signed was a piece of me that died. But it was also a step toward an Ellie I had yet to meet. Martin made a point of looking victorious. He would arrive at the hearings impeccably dressed, speaking with condescension, as if he were doing me a favor. But I never reacted. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. I knew he expected that from me, and I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I would be strong, even if it was just out of pride. Even if the strength was just a facade for now. My eyes burned, but my chin remained high. That night, I swore to myself that he would one day regret this. Moving day arrived faster than I expected. Or maybe I just wasn't ready to face it. The house I had lived in for nearly 2 decades was now just an empty stage, with echoes of old laughter and footsteps that no longer existed. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, a memory, a sigh. Packing up my belongings was like dismantling my own history, piece by piece. And the more I packed, the more I felt like I was shedding parts of myself. There was an invisible weight in every photo I placed in a box, in every book I took from the shelf. It was as if the house were whispering, "You failed." And I didn't have the strength to answer. It hurt to open drawers and find old notes, forgotten t-shirts, and realize that the past would never return. I wondered if Martin felt anything when he left all this to me, or if his coldness was in fact complete. Maybe I would never know. In the garage, the loaded car seemed too small for so many memories. Jared helped me in silence, avoiding my eyes. It was hard for him too, I knew. He didn't choose this breakup, but he was still living through it with me. When I closed the door for the last time, my fingers touched the frame in a silent farewell. I took a deep breath, as if drawing the courage I lacked from the air itself. As I drove to my new destination, tears streamed down my face and I couldn't stop them. It was the end of an era. The end of the woman who believed in effortless happy endings. The landscape blurred past the window, and all I could see was absence. When I pulled up in front of the small rented apartment building, I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me, as if I were about to fall into a world I didn't know. Every box was another cut to my heart. The apartment was tiny and smelled of fresh paint, as if trying to compensate for its lack of soul with a clean appearance. As I stepped inside, the emptiness swallowed me. There was no furniture yet, just a few suitcases, boxes, and a makeshift mattress on the floor. The echo of my footsteps was almost offensive. I sat in the corner of the living room, hugging my knees, trying to convince myself that this place was a new beginning. But all I felt was loneliness. The bare walls seemed to mock my fragility. With every new sound, the dripping of the sink, the distant engine of a car, I shrank as if I were made of glass. I was afraid. Afraid I wouldn't make it, that I would sink, that I would never recognize myself again. Cooking for myself felt like a strange gesture. Eating alone a punishment. And sleeping was the biggest challenge of all. The bed, yet to be assembled, was just a mattress on the floor. I spread a random sheet over it and lay down, staring at the white ceiling that told me I didn't belong there. My pillow was wet before I even closed my eyes, and in that darkness everything felt too big. The pain, the silence, the emptiness. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but who would understand this kind of pain? It was as if the world had shrunk, and I had been forgotten by it. There, on that raw and heartless night, I realized that the hardest part wasn't the end of the marriage. It was what was left afterward. The absence of an us was a hole impossible to fill. The silence was deafening, and the bed felt like an abyss. The next day, Becky showed up with grocery bags, new cushions, and that stubborn smile of someone who refuses to watch me fall apart. "We'll figure this out," she said, trying to liven up the space with jokes and plans. But I could barely follow her words. My mind wandered, my body felt heavy, and my heart seemed frozen. I knew she wanted to help, and I wanted to accept it, but something inside me was too broken. She started organizing the kitchen, filling the empty cabinets with packages of rice, pasta, and crackers as if that could nourish me from the inside too. She talked about shows I should watch, online courses, apps for meeting new people. I just nodded, trapped in my own fog. Everything seemed so distant, so out of my reach. There were moments when I managed to smile, more out of politeness than any real desire. And she noticed. Becky always noticed. But she didn't give up. She stayed there, insisting on reminding me that I still existed, even when I myself forgot. I admired that loyalty, and felt guilty for not being able to reciprocate. Deep down, I wanted to believe I could get back on my feet. I wanted to feel that this was just a phase. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I didn't recognize. A faded woman without direction, without light. Not even I believed I could get out of there. But something inside me was beginning to stir. However quietly. I was reorganizing one of the last boxes when I found an old, dusty photo album, something I didn't even remember keeping. I sat on the cold living room floor and began to flip through it slowly, as if touching relics. On every page, smiles frozen in time stared back at me, reminding me of a past that, for a long time I had believed was real. Martin by my side, Jared still a little boy, summer trips, parties with friends, moments when apparently everything was fine. But something started to bother me. A detail here, a look there. In one of the photos taken at Jared's birthday, Diane appeared in the background, smiling at the camera. She was a colleague of Martin's at the time, and until then I had never suspected anything. But in that picture my eyes fixed on something that had escaped me before. Martin wasn't looking at me, he was looking at her. And there was an intensity in that gaze that sent a chill down my spine. I continued flipping, my hands now trembling. In another image, they were side by side, toasting with wine glasses. It was a company party, and I remembered that night vaguely. At the time I saw nothing wrong. But now, with the distance of time and the fresh pain of the separation, I noticed the cracks hidden behind the smiles. The pieces began to fall into place, even though I didn't want to see the full picture. I started to question the past with new eyes. Could what I had considered a friendship between them have actually been a disguised affair? How could I have been so blind, so trusting, so naive? What were once good memories had become evidence of something much crueler. The way he looked at her. It wasn't the look of a friend. Driven by a growing unease, I started digging through old emails, forgotten messages, files on flash drives that came with me in the move. And then there it was. A receipt for a stay at a resort in Aspen, on a date when Martin swore he was on a business trip. Diane's name was on the same receipt, as an additional guest. My heart raced. My stomach turned. This was no longer a doubt, it was a confirmation. I went through the document folder on Martin's old computer, where I had copied files as a precaution. Emails from the sender D.Turner appeared with uncomfortable frequency. Exchanges that were too friendly, inside jokes, conversations outside of work hours. And then a blunt message. I still think about that night. My world spun. It was like being pushed back into the abyss. Only this time with my eyes wide open. I remembered the times he came home too late, smelling of a perfume that wasn't mine. The increasingly flimsy excuses. The calls he took in another room. I wanted to scream, but there was no one there to hear me. I felt the ground give way, as if I were being torn from myself. I had been deceived for so long. And worse, right under my own roof. To be betrayed by the person who should have been your safe harbor is a pain that has no name. Martin didn't just choose someone else, he chose to lie, cheat, and then humiliate me afterward. The divorce was just the final act. The entire play had been staged long before. I was the last to know. The affair began long before the end, and I was the last one to find out. In the days that followed, I walked around the apartment like a ghost. Every corner felt tighter, as if it wanted to crush me. But unlike before, there was something different in me now. The pain was still there, throbbing, but it was beginning to transform. There was anger, yes, but there was also something deeper, indignation. It wasn't fair. And I was tired of accepting injustice as a part of life. I started looking at myself in the mirror with new eyes. I no longer saw just the wounded woman, but someone who was beginning to see the truth clearly. It wasn't about him, about what he did or didn't do. It was about me, about what I would allow to define my steps from now on. For the first time in a long time, I didn't just want to survive, I wanted to make it count. I called Becky and told her everything. She was silent for a moment and then she said, "This changes everything, but it can also set you free." Her words resonated within me with force. Yes, it hurt. Yes, it was unfair. But I had two options. Continue to sink in that pain or use it as fuel. I was facing a choice I hadn't asked for, but now it was mine. It was there, in that silent moment, that I made my decision. I would no longer feel sorry for myself, nor would I wait for justice to come from others. I would be my own strength, my own judgment, my own redemption. I could fall apart, or I could rise. I chose the second option. That morning everything seemed ordinary. I had my coffee in a hurry, took the crowded subway, and walked up the stairs of the building where I had worked for 8 years. I greeted colleagues, organized some files, and answered emails like any other day, until my name was called over the loudspeaker, summoning me to a meeting in the administrative department. The neutral tone of the voice gave nothing away, but something in me already knew something was wrong. When I entered the room, I found 2 supervisors and a company lawyer. The air was thick, and before I could even sit down, one of the managers began to speak, reading a mechanical speech about restructuring and unavoidable cuts. My palms were sweating, my heart was racing. I tried to ask why, tried to argue that my performance had always been exemplary, but there was no room for discussion. It was a final decision. They handed me a cardboard box to carry my personal belongings and escorted me to my desk with downcast eyes. I felt exposed, discarded, like a part that was no longer useful. Colleagues avoided my gaze, while others muttered apologies that seemed more like discomfort than empathy. And I, without reacting, began to mechanically pack my things. A picture frame, a mug, a few notebooks. As I left the building with the box in my arms and the cloudy sky above me, I felt a strange dizziness, as if the ground had disappeared. There on the sidewalk in broad daylight, I realized that there was nothing stable left in my life. The marriage was over. The house was gone. And now the job was gone too. I looked down at the box in my hands and thought, I'm truly starting from scratch. I got home and fell apart. I lay on the cold living room floor and cried uncontrollably. The feeling of failure swallowed me like a raging sea. I didn't know how I would pay next month's rent, let alone where to look for another job at my age with my baggage in my emotional state. It was as if all the pillars had been torn out at once, and I was in a freefall with no end in sight. During one sleepless night, I considered the unthinkable. I picked up my phone and typed a message to Martin. It was brief, without any appeal, just asking if he could help me with a loan until I could get back on my feet. I stared at the screen for long minutes, my finger hovering over the send button. But then I saw my reflection in the window pane. Defeated, humiliated, desperate. I deleted the message. I also deleted the idea that he still had any place in my life. He had already taken everything from me: dignity, peace, security. He would not have my pride as well. I would have to manage on my own, no matter how impossible it seemed. I would rather face the world on an empty stomach than accept a handout from the man who threw me away. And in that instant my pain began to turn into stubbornness. Hunger may weaken the body, but humiliation strengthens the soul of those who choose to resist. I didn't know what to do, but I knew what I wouldn't do. I would not kneel before Martin. I would not accept being the woman he said I was. There was a small flame inside me, a resistance whispering that I could still fight. I'd rather starve than ask him for anything. Becky showed up the following Saturday with 2 grocery bags, an encouraging smile, and an idea. You've always made beautiful crafts, Ellie. Why don't you try selling them? I looked at her skeptically. The necklaces, lamps, and cards I made as a hobby seemed insignificant compared to the chaos I was living in. But she insisted. People pay for unique things. And your work is special. We spent the afternoon organizing the materials I still had stored away. Paints, brushes, special papers, some old tools. Becky took pictures of the pieces with her phone and showed me how to set up a simple profile to promote them. I watched everything, still somewhat numb, but there was something comforting in the activity. Something that gave me, for the first time in days, a purpose. I started making a few pieces without any real expectations, just to test the waters. And as I saw everything displayed on the improvised table in the living room, I felt a timid spark of hope. It was small, it was uncertain, but it was mine. A small act of reclaiming my life. It wasn't just about making money. It was about rediscovering something in myself that I had forgotten existed. A simple idea. That could be the beginning of everything. And there, among threads, paints, and cardboard, something much bigger than I imagined was being born. I spent days watching online tutorials on how to set up a virtual store. I was never very tech-savvy, but little by little, I learned how to create a decent profile, take good photos, and write appealing descriptions. Everything was improvised. The photos were taken with my phone on the balcony. The logo was drawn on paper, and then digitized with Becky's help. Nothing looked professional, but it was sincere. It was mine. I chose the name carefully. Patches of Light. It represented exactly how I felt. A tangle of pieces trying to find their shine again. The store was ready on a rainy afternoon, and I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. It was like putting myself completely out there, showing the world something born from my pain. Part of me wanted to give up, to close it all down, to hide. But then I took a deep breath and thought, if I don't try, I'll never know. It was more than just selling, it was an act of courage. My heart was pounding as if I were about to jump off a cliff. And maybe that's what it was, a leap, a bet on myself. Even without guarantees, even without enough faith. With fear in my heart, I clicked the publish button. For the first 2 days, nothing happened. No likes, no comments, no visits. I thought about deleting everything and pretending it never existed. But on the 3rd day, an email arrived. It was a notification. You have a new order. I froze, reading and rereading it, thinking it was some kind of spam. But it wasn't. A woman from a small town had bought one of my handmade candle holders. I opened her profile with trembling hands. She collected handmade items and wrote about them on a personal blog. I cried right there, alone in my living room, as if I had received the biggest award of my life. Someone somewhere had seen value in what I created. She didn't know me, didn't know my story, but she believed in what she saw. And that was enough. I prepared the package with the utmost care. I wrote a handwritten note, thanking her for her trust. I chose a beautiful box, tied it with a ribbon, and placed a small dried flower next to the wrapping. When I mailed it at the post office, I held back tears in front of the clerk, but inside I was bursting. For the first time in months, I felt useful. Someone believed in me, even if I didn't quite believe in myself yet. A few days later, she left a review. She praised the craftsmanship, the care in the details, the delicacy of the piece. She said she felt an emotional connection when she opened the package. I read her words over and over, like listening to a song that touches you deeply. Then another person commented on the page, and one more followed the profile. They were small gestures, but for me they caused seismic shifts. Becky celebrated as if we were partners in a major company. You may not see it, but this is just the beginning, she said excitedly. And I smiled shyly, still not fully believing it. But I felt something new. A spark of competence, of self-esteem. It was as if a part of that faded Ellie was beginning to reappear among the paints, brushes, and kind words from strangers. That night I sat on the balcony and looked up at the dark sky, feeling a kind of peace that hadn't visited my heart in a long time. Maybe there was something in me worth saving. Maybe I wasn't the fragile, incapable figure Martin had insisted on painting. Maybe I was finally the author of my own story. Maybe I wasn't so incapable after all. If one customer came, others would come too. Over time, the orders started to become more frequent. 1 a week, then 2, then 3. Some customers returned to buy more pieces, while others recommended the shop to their friends. I began to recognize names, addresses, even personal tastes. I created with them in mind, as if each order were a silent conversation. Slowly, my small improvised shop was turning into a network of affection, and I was becoming someone with a purpose. Becky celebrated each new order like a victory. She helped me organize materials, responded to messages when I was overwhelmed, and even started jotting down ideas for future collections. I was still doing everything myself: production, packaging, marketing. But the demand was growing, and with it so was my unease. Could I really take this further? Was there room to truly grow? I started to imagine a small studio, a more professional website, a more elaborate brand identity. They were timid dreams, but persistent. I wrote down ideas in a worn-out notebook I kept by my bed. I daydreamed between one order and the next. And somewhere between exhaustion and hope, I understood something essential. What I was doing touched people. And that, in itself, was a seed for the future. But every seed needs fertile soil to flourish. And mine was limited. I lacked resources, infrastructure, time. On my own I could continue. But for how long? I started to feel that I needed something more, not out of ambition, but out of a sense of responsibility for what I was building. If I had support, this could really grow. The message arrived on an ordinary morning, between a lukewarm coffee and a box about to be sealed. It was short, direct. Your work touched me deeply. I've been in your shoes. I'd like to talk. It was signed only CW. At first I thought it was a joke. But a few days later, a new, more detailed email arrived with a concrete proposal. Financial investment and mentorship to expand my shop. I was suspicious. Who in their right mind would offer that kind of help to a stranger? I replied politely, asking for more information. She responded with calm and patience without any pressure. She said she had been following my work, reading my posts, and saw potential. I see something in you that I recognize in myself. You just need an opportunity. Those words pierced me like arrows. We scheduled a video call. Clara Whitman appeared on the screen with calm eyes, a firm smile, and a voice that overflowed with experience. She told me she had also started with a small shop, had gone through a traumatic divorce, and that someone had helped her when she needed it most. Now she wanted to pay it forward. She wasn't demanding absurd percentages or control over my decisions. Only commitment, honesty, and courage. I listened in silence, trying to find a flaw, a sign of dishonesty. But everything about Clara seemed transparent. There was a light in her eyes that reminded me of someone who had hit rock bottom and come back. Something in me wanted to trust her, even with fear knocking at my door. Who was she? And why did she want to help me? I spent days analyzing every detail of the proposal, rereading emails, rewatching our conversation. I spoke with Becky, who encouraged me to follow my heart, but to keep my feet on the ground. Everything seemed right, professional, fair, structured. And yet, fear followed me like a shadow. After all, the last time I trusted blindly, everything fell apart. But maybe this time the risk was different. Maybe it was necessary. I weighed every possibility, and I realized that the biggest threat was no longer failing. It was continuing to hide from who I could become. So I replied. I said yes. We scheduled another meeting, I signed the first documents, and I received an initial investment that would allow me to professionalize my business. With it came the feeling of entering a new world, uncertain, but full of possibilities. Clara introduced me to people, suggested changes, brought new ideas. And with every step, I felt fear and excitement in equal measure. But there was one essential detail. For the first time, someone with power looked at me with respect, not superiority. And that made all the difference. I had been deceived before. But something about her was different. The partnership had begun, and I could no longer turn back. Clara's arrival changed everything, not just financially but in the way I saw my work. She brought in Brian Lee, a quiet and brilliant programmer, who began to rethink the entire structure of the online store. Together we defined a new visual identity, restructured the catalog, and created themed collection packages. I, who had once improvised everything at home, now had a small space adapted as a studio. Brian automated processes, created an efficient ordering system, and even integrated it with social media. It all felt too big for me, but at the same time familiar, as if I were finally occupying a place that belonged to me. Clara handled the strategy, Brian the technology, and I, the heart of the business, the creation. It was a well-oiled machine, even with a few small stumbles. I started waking up early with a sense of purpose and going to bed late with a feeling of accomplishment. The exhaustion was now welcome. I immersed myself in every detail. The choice of colors, the design of the pieces, the tone of the posts. It was no longer just a craft, it was an identity. It was impact. And as much as I still carried internal doubts, something in me was beginning to truly blossom. There, among papers, threads, and screens, not just a new business was being born but a new Ellie. Someone who dared to dream, who no longer hid behind her losses. Now everything had more color, more meaning. And even with the uncertainties that came with it, I felt ready. Every detail seemed like a piece of something bigger. Jared, my son, began to notice the changes. At first it was just curiosity. Are you still doing those little craft things? But as he saw the new packaging, the praise on social media, and the materials spread around the house, he started to take an interest. One day he walked into the makeshift studio, picked up one of the pieces and said, "You did all this by yourself?" And there was admiration in his voice. He began to follow some of the orders, ask about deadlines, and give me suggestions. Sometimes he would sit with me while I created, watching in silence. And inside I tried to hold back my emotions. My son, who for months could barely look me in the eye after the divorce, was now getting closer. The connection I thought was lost was being rebuilt. Not with words but with his presence. One day, he showed me an app that could make tracking deliveries easier. He started managing the shipments, organizing spreadsheets, and even proofreading product descriptions. It was as if, little by little, he was entering this world that was born from me and becoming a part of it. Our bond, once broken by pain, was now being stitched together by collaboration. Seeing Jared involved, interested, was more than gratifying. It was healing. It was as if he were saying with his actions, "I believe in you, Mom." And maybe I needed that more than anything else. He looked at me with respect. For the first time in years. With the store's growth, Clara suggested I participate in a local event for new entrepreneurs. It was a small fair to present to potential investors and partners. My first instinct was to refuse. Public speaking, selling myself, showcasing my project in front of experienced and successful people? I wasn't part of that world. I still saw myself as a beginner too fragile for a stage. But she insisted with both gentleness and firmness. You need to position yourself as what you already are. An entrepreneur. Brian helped with the presentation, Becky lent me a new dress, and Jared taught me how to use the portable projector. I rehearsed for days in front of the mirror, making mistakes, crying, starting over. But deep down I knew. If I didn't face that fear, I would never move forward. On the morning of the event, my hands were sweating, my voice was trembling, and my legs felt like glass. But I got on that stage anyway. I looked at the audience, took a deep breath, and began. I told my story. I showed my products. I spoke of the emotional impact they had on so many women. I was shaking inside, but my voice found its firmness. And when I finished, the room was silent for a second. And then came the applause. Long, intense, coming from all sides. People came up to me afterward to congratulate me, to ask for my card, to ask if I would consider a partnership. It was like stepping out of a shadow and into the full light for the first time. I was trembling. But I went up there anyway. And when I finished, the entire room applauded. It was through a mutual friend that Diane learned of my success. It didn't take long for a message from her to appear on my phone, asking to talk like adults. I was tempted to ignore it, but I agreed to meet. I wanted to look into the eyes of the woman who had helped destroy my life. We met at a sophisticated cafe, the kind of place she always liked to show off. Diane arrived on time, impeccable, but with a slight discomfort behind her rehearsed smile. She started by praising my resilience, saying I must be exhausted from trying so hard to look strong. And then, without beating around the bush, she fired. "Don't you think you've had your run? Not every woman is meant to lead." I sat motionless for a few seconds, processing the audacity of her words. She proposed that I sell the company while it still had some value. She said she knew people who were interested. She spoke of pragmatism, of not stretching out your dreams. And then I understood she was afraid. The success of a woman she had helped humiliate was bothering her. Her own security was shaken by my rise. She had come to extinguish my light, but she found a lighthouse instead. I stood up from the table calmly. I told her I didn't need her approval, nor her advice disguised as threats. I thanked her for her concern and left. She remained behind, trying to maintain her composure. But in her eyes I saw it. She was no longer laughing at me. She didn't expect me to be so strong. Days later, I launched a new collection of pieces with a strong social message. A portion of the proceeds would be donated to shelters for women in situations of violence. The campaign was an instant success, until the website mysteriously went down. The social media accounts were also compromised, and the company's email was hacked. I panicked. It felt like everything was collapsing again. I called Brian immediately. He analyzed the system and found traces of sabotage. The IP address came from a computer linked to a communications firm, one that Diane currently managed. The confirmation left me breathless. That woman was trying to erase me again, this time from the shadows. But she had forgotten one crucial thing. I was no longer the same person. Thanks to Clara's guidance, I had learned to protect my business. We had backups, recovery systems, and even an emergency crisis plan. In a few hours, we managed to restore the website, issue a statement, and regain control of the accounts. I lost sales that day, yes. But I gained something much greater. Proof that I could get back up even under attack. I didn't cry, I didn't despair, I didn't play the victim. I just reacted. With agility, with intelligence, with maturity. And, above all, with strategy. She thought I would fall just like before, but she forgot that now I had a support network, preparation, and a purpose. But this time I had backups. In the following days, we received messages of support, new orders, and even an article in a digital magazine about our brand's entrepreneurial resilience. I could have exposed Diane publicly, but I didn't. I knew that silence would bother her more. I continued to grow quietly, like someone who sows in the dark and reaps in the light of day. I reinforced the system's security, increased internal controls, delegated tasks, and learned even more from the mistake. Every fall taught me where to strengthen the foundation. Becky said I seemed more steadfast. Clara congratulated me. Brian remained by my side with loyalty. And me? I smiled with something Diane would never understand. Consistency. I decided not to react on impulse anymore. From now on, every move I made would be calculated. If she wanted war, I would give her indifference. If she wanted a stage, I would continue to grow off the radar. And if she attacked again, I would already have plenty of plans. I learned how to fall. And how to get back up. Her reaction would be my greatest victory. Jared began to manage the financial side of the business with surprising attention to detail. He organized spreadsheets, checked payment deadlines, and analyzed bank transactions with precision. It was he who noticed something strange. A recurring automatic transfer of a small amount, coming from an account linked to the old address of the house where we used to live. We investigated together. And with Brian's help, we discovered that Martin had accessed my tax information years ago and linked a business account to my name, as if we were still married. I was in shock. He had been skimming a portion of my profits through an obscure system, as if he had some right to my success. Jared was silent for a long time, staring at the printed statement. When he looked up, there was something in his eyes I had never seen before. Revulsion. He stole from you, Mom. And he tried to deceive me my whole life. He said it in a low voice, but it was full of resolve. It was more than indignation. It was a fracture opening between father and son. A line of trust being violently broken. Jared couldn't understand how someone could act that way toward the woman he now saw with so much pride. It was betrayal, it was theft, it was manipulation. And he had no intention of pretending that nothing had happened. Martin had just lost more than money. He had lost the admiration of his own son. He no longer believed in the father he once knew. Jared went to Martin's office the next day. He didn't tell me beforehand, only after. He said he walked in without asking for permission, looked his father in the eyes, and without mincing words confronted him. He threw the documents on the desk, demanding an explanation. Martin tried to deflect, saying it was complicated, that there were nuances. But Jared firm did not back down. You lied. You stole. And you still have the nerve to think you deserve respect. Martin was speechless. He tried to blame me, as he always did, suggesting I should be grateful to still be on my feet. Jared then stood up, pointed at him and said, "She owes you nothing. And neither do I." And he walked out without looking back. He told me all of this later with tears in his eyes, and a weight lifted from his shoulders. He hugged me that night like never before. He said that he now saw everything clearly, that he was by my side no matter the cost, and that he no longer wanted any contact with his father. It hurt to see my son make that choice, but at the same time, I knew he was finally freeing himself from a false image, and getting closer truly to the woman I had always been. There, between us, something reconfigured. Jared was no longer the confused boy after the divorce. He was a man who chose integrity, who knew who he wanted to be, and who now walked by my side with his eyes wide open. I don't need you to be someone anymore. Weeks later, we were invited, Clara and I, to present our story at a national event for women's entrepreneurship. It would be broadcast online, with a full audience and influential business leaders present. I found out that Martin and Diane would also be there, representing their new marketing firm. My heart pounded. It was inevitable. The confrontation would happen. But this time I was ready. I walked onto the stage in a navy blue dress that Becky had helped me pick out. Jared was in the audience, Clara by my side, Brian in the tech area, and my name shining on the big screen. I told my journey without embellishments, without omitting the pain. I spoke of the falls, the losses, the rebuilding. And when I mentioned the sabotage, the manipulation, and the strength that was born from chaos, I looked directly to the back of the audience, where Martin was staring at me, tense. Diane had her arms crossed, feigning disinterest. But I saw the discomfort in her eyes. I spoke of dignity, of women who rise again, of emotional justice, and the audience applauded at every turn. I didn't mention any names, but everyone knew. The whispers in the audience were clear. As I stepped off the stage, a journalist approached me. "You are the most talked about story of the event." I just smiled. That day I was the one who laughed. He cried. Finally, the story was on my side. Receiving the official invitation was surreal. One of the country's largest social entrepreneurship institutions had chosen me as the honoree of the year. My journey, once marked by silence and scars, was now being celebrated on a national level. I walked onto the stage with tears in my eyes, listening to my story being told by another voice, one that now saw me with admiration. The audience gave a standing ovation. It was real. I was there. I was called an example of overcoming adversity, a symbol of resilience, an inspiration to other women. Hearing this moved me, but it also grounded me a little. Because deep down I didn't want to be a myth. I just wanted to show that it's possible. That even with everything against you, you can still be reborn. I looked at Clara in the front row, at Becky smiling beside her, and at Jared, who was recording everything with shining eyes. I held the glass trophy as if I were holding my own restored soul. I remembered the Ellie of the past, collapsed on the living room floor, unemployed, alone, betrayed. And I realized how much that pain had transformed me. It didn't destroy me, it shaped me. Every stone in my path was now part of the foundation on which I was building something much bigger than I ever imagined. I took a deep breath, letting the audience applaud for longer than I thought I deserved. And in that moment I didn't think about revenge or payback. I thought about peace. I thought about meaning. I heard my name echoing and felt a true sense of pride. Months later, I was invited to give a speech at a conference for women entrepreneurs. It was a packed auditorium with attentive eyes and open hearts. Women of all ages, some already crying in the first few minutes. I told my story with truth, without frills. I shared the failures as much as the successes. I spoke about fear, shame, and also about courage, the kind that is only born when you have nothing left to lose. They listened to me as if they were listening to a mirror speak. Many saw themselves in me, not as a businesswoman or a speaker, but as an ordinary woman who fell and got back up. At the end, dozens came to hug me, to share their stories, to thank me for the hope. There, among timid smiles and trembling hands, I realized that my pain had become a bridge, that my path could light theirs. A young woman told me, I was going to give up on my dream, but now I think I'll try one more time. And that was enough. It wasn't about fame or financial success, it was about impact. About being a beacon for those walking in the dark. I returned home that day with a light heart, as if every step I had taken was worth it. Each one of them was a potential Ellie. Today I look back with serenity. I hold the pains like red pages of an old book. I don't forget, but I no longer carry the weight. Martin, Diane, the divorce, the humiliation. All of it was part of the storm that made me bloom. I don't wish for revenge, only distance. What they tried to destroy became the very thing that strengthened me. There is something sacred in surviving, and even more in thriving. My home is now full of life, my company impacts communities, and my name inspires women who once saw themselves as small. And perhaps most importantly, I found myself again. I became who I needed to be, not because of them but in spite of them. I close my eyes and repeat with a peaceful smile. Thank you for leaving me, Martin. It was the best thing you ever did for me. After all, it was from my new beginning that my greatness was born. Now I'm curious about you, who has heard my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Support the channel by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing this video. I'm leaving another story on the end screen that I think you'll also enjoy, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.